Hello, everyone. Welcome to this fantastic new meeting, our April meeting for the Hellenic Writers Group. And tonight, I am so happy we are hosting Mr. John DeDakis for this special workshop. Thank you, John, for accepting our invitation to give us one of your super effective workshops today. I know they are super effective because I have had the privilege of attending one a few months ago. John is an award-winning novelist. I can stop right here, and we can listen intently to all he has to teach us. But I'll give you the whole picture. John is a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. John is the author of 5 novels in the Lark Chadwick mystery suspense thriller series. Book 6, Enemies Domestic, a political thriller, will be released this summer. DeDakis is a former White House correspondent and is also a writing coach, manuscript editor, and host of the podcast One to One. John's father was born in the village of Lavka near Corinth and came to the United States in 1913. He was a district governor of AHEPA in the Chicago area in the 1930s. Originally from La Crosse, Wisconsin, John DeDakis now lives with his wife, Cindy, in Baltimore, Maryland. He has a website, if you'd like to note it down, www.johndedakis.com. Don't write the one word, though. John's workshop today is about buffing and polishing. Our manuscripts, I don't mean our nails. In his words, you finally finished your manuscript and now you're ready to tell Oprah all about it. Not so fast. The best writing is rewriting. In this session, you'll learn practical ways to put your writing on a flab-burning diet so that your copy is tight, trim, and hot, and all without ever having to step onto a treadmill. So treadmill is away. The mic is yours. John, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And it's good to be here with you all. I want to share my screen and we'll get started. And let me just make sure that you see it. It should be, I'm going to make it full screen, but let me just make sure that you see my picture, my name,
Yes.
Buffing and polishing. Everybody sees that? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more. From La Crosse, Wisconsin, right along the Mississippi River, which is Wisconsin's west coast. My dad came from Lavka, which is about 30 miles west of Corinth on the Peloponnese. My grandparents, Yaya and Papu, had their first kiss on the Acropolis in 1903. The name was originally spelled Tentakis, N-T-E-N-T-A-K-I-S. It was Ellis Islanded to DeDakis in 1913 when they came over. Then in 1915, there was a typo in the Chicago phone book, and the second D was accidentally capitalized. And so Papu said, that's cool, or whatever the Greek equivalent is of that. So our particular strand of DeDakis has a capitalized second D. It is not DeDakis. When DeDakis was running for president in 1988, my wife was going through the checkout line at the grocery store and handed her check to the checkout person, and the person looked and went, "Oh, DeDakis, are you related?" And Cindy goes, "No, he spells his name D-U-K. Ours is D-E-D." And the woman goes, "Oh, are you related?" So you, I'm sure, have all gone through variations of this. That's Papu with my dad. When my dad, little guy there, was 5 years old. I think this is just before they left Greece for the United States. That's my dad as a young man with Yaya. My grandmother was a hat maker in Athens, and that's Yaya and Papu in older age. And again, Yaya has a elaborate concoction that she made, and uh, uh, so and that's the mom and the dad. My mom comes from a German background, and when she was dating my dad, one of the relatives, my Aunt Anna, said to my mom, Ruth, the children will be colored. And my mom goes, so? But that doesn't mean that, there weren't bumps along the way. My dad, when he was at the University of Chicago, uh, pledged a fraternity, a law fraternity, and he was blackballed because he was Greek, which shows that bigotry is totally illogical. The Greek system that they were heralding and celebrating blackballed him because of his heritage. So, life is crazy. That's mom and dad. In later life, they were married for 53 years. I think they aged pretty well. Dad lived to about 88. Mom died just before her 80th birthday. And that's me, Geek of the Year in 1956. We'll move on because here's what we're going to get into a little bit. You're all going to be drawing from personal experience, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. Life doesn't always turn out the way you expect, and in journalism, that's a story. In real life, often it's a crisis, and in fiction, it's a plot twist. And we all have those plot twists, which make life interesting. In my case, my dad was a lawyer, so I was going to go into practice with him, and then I was going to use the law as a stepping stone. And eventually, my plan was to live here at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Uh, for the good of the country, however, I decided to go in a different direction, which started the shift. The twist started in 1968. I was a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The Vietnam War was in all the papers. They had a draft. If you had a number below 150, chances are you were going to get drafted and sent to Vietnam. That's sort of a typical day at the University of Wisconsin. I'm not in the picture, but the anti-war fervor was very powerful because most of these people were of draft age and were at risk of going overseas to Vietnam. I felt that I was just bombarded from both the left and the right to take a position for or against the war. And I just felt that the rhetoric was overheated. And so I joined a campus radio station because I felt journalism was the good perch to sit on to try to find out what the facts are. So there I am as a reporter at covering a teaching assistant strike, I think, but I was tear gassed covering an anti-war riot. My parents heard their little boy getting tear gassed on the radio, and they encouraged me to switch schools, which I did. But the problem was I had a student deferment, but Playboy magazine was voted UW-Madison the #1 party school in the country back in 1969 or so. And I saw it as my personal responsibility to be the #1 partier. I didn't succeed, but I had so much fun trying that my grade point average was 1.95. I was that close to getting kicked out of school. And my draft number in the lottery was 14. So it did not look good. Long story short, I enlisted to avoid the draft because that way I would have more control over what I'd do when I was in the Army. And so I enlisted for military journalism. That's me with my M16 and my bayonet between my teeth and basic training at Fort Lewis, Washington, near Seattle. Um, Let me just go back quickly to say that I did get orders to Vietnam, but the major plot twist was that 2 weeks before I was to ship out, my orders were changed to Germany, and I spent the next 2.5 years at the headquarters of the American Forces Radio and Television Network in Frankfurt, Germany, doing interviews for a special events radio unit. My boss, Herb Glover, on the right there, Herb used to work at CBS with Walter Cronkite. And Herb had a mentoring heart. And one of the first interviews he assigned me to do when I started working for him was with this guy named Alfred Hitchcock. Maybe you've heard of him. I mean, this was a pivotal experience for me because Herb could have done the interview in his sleep, and he trusted this 23-year-old kid not to screw it up. And what happened is I found out what I was good at and what I loved, and when you put those two things together, you've really got some purpose and propulsion going forward. So I got out of the Army and went into journalism. And my parents uh, felt that the mainstream media had run Nixon out of the White House. And so, as far as my mom was concerned, I joined the dark side. But basically, she told me, she said, if I, she accepted that I went into journalism, but she said, if I ever hear any bias in your reporting, even if it's an opinion I agree with, you've failed. Just give me the facts and let me make up my own mind, which became the rule, the guiding force in my journalism career. And in journalism, they have a saying, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. So that pretty much guided my career for 45 years. Um, I went to first television job was at the NBC affiliate in Madison, Wisconsin. You could probably caption this another reason why you shouldn't do drugs. We'll move on. I covered the White House for the last 3 years of Reagan's presidency. That's me in the upper right with my camera crew. Larry Speaks was Reagan's press secretary. The Gipper there is sitting at the Resolute desk. And this was a piece we were doing on the White House press corps versus the president. And one of the takeaways for me is that it is, by definition, an adversarial relationship. It was Larry's job to make Reagan look perfect. It was our job as reporters to find out what's really going on. And so just about every president at one point or another doesn't like their press coverage. And unlike what some ex-presidents will tell you, it is a firing offense at a reputable news organization to make things up. Fake news gets you fired. So that's that. Not going to dwell on it. But this experience did inform my writing. I joined CNN in 1988 in Atlanta as a writer. Within a month, or not a month, about 9 months, they made me an editor, which is like a goalie. You're trying to catch all the mistakes before they get on the air. The last 7 years, I was one of Wolf Blitzer's editors in Washington. That's a picture of me holding the Peabody Award that we won for our coverage of the 2008 presidential election. That's the nanosecond I was allowed to hold it before they took the picture, and then I had to give it back to Wolf, who really could have earned that all by himself because he's so smart, he could ad-lib the whole show. One of the things I discovered as an editor is that it's tedious. It's fault finding, but it pays well. And so I started writing fiction probably back in 1994, but it took 10 years for me to get an agent and to get published. So I've been a traditionally published author for the last 20 years or so. And those are the novels that I've written. Fast Track Bluff. I hiked the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu in Peru to research Bluff. Troubled Water is set in, the first two are set in southern Wisconsin. Troubled Water is in Georgia. Uh, by the time Bullet in the Chamber comes along, my protagonist, Lark Chadwick, is a White House correspondent. And in Fake, which is my most recent one, she's a White House correspondent and the victim of fake news. So you write what you know, and that's where we are. And I think Andy mentioned that my sixth novel, a political thriller, is coming out this summer, and you get a chance to vote on the cover. This is not released yet, but these are two of the leading candidates for the cover. Lark is pregnant by the time we get to this story. It's her first day on the job as White House press secretary. The first question that she's asked on live television comes from a Tucker Carlson type who asks, "Are you or are you not planning to abort your unborn child. So that's how the book begins. We're going to deal with white Christian nationalism, QAnon, mental illness, and abortion. And so, enemies domestic is taken from the oath of office, where government officials, including the president, pledge to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So I don't know, any thoughts, any votes on which one, the one on the left, whoops, sorry, the one on the left or the one on the right?
The one on the right with the Statue of Liberty facing,
Away.
Out.
yeah,
Yes, me
away.
too.
That's really
The one on the
creative.
right. Yes.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
Yeah, I
agree.
love that.
Yes, I agree with that because that's very unique. We've seen it many times facing the front, but the back and the hand raised is like you're standing behind it as well. So
Yeah.
And the hand raised to the right
yes,
is leading you forward.
Well, listen to you. Boy, you all
Yeah.
have very definite
I
opinions.
like the one on the right because if I remember correctly, the Statue of Liberty faces away from New York, so she's welcoming the people who are coming to America. And so if we're domestic, we're looking at her backside, right?
Yeah, exactly. You guys are overthinking this, but that's wonderful.
Yeah, I think the one on the right has a lot of subliminal messages, including activism in there. And I see both male and female archetypes represented in that right image, which I think is also central to the story, it sounds like.
You guys are great. Holy cow.
One other thing that stands out to me is the on the right is the sepia, the right terminology for that. It reminds me of like an old document. So maybe we're gonna look into, the Constitution and words of the founding fathers, right?
There you go. There you go. We are this is probably not the final image, but I think we're going to try to lighten this up and make it a little more obvious that it's parchment. So you nailed it, Maria. Okay, well, thank you. Moving on, we're going to talk about buffing and polishing, a guide to rewriting. I'll pause for just a quick second to see if you have any questions, comments before we dig into the art of rewriting. The question is, when's he going to get on with buffing and polishing? He's going to do that right now.
Oh, I enjoyed hearing your background. It's great. And I love the way you did it with all those pictures. That's really that's really neat.
Thank you. And in fact, we're actually planning, Cindy and I are planning a trip to Greece in September. I've been there once before. I went with my dad and mom in 1973, and my dad went back to Lafka. I was the family photographer. He spoke Greek. I do not, sadly. And so we saw some of the relatives, and he got kind of emotional. And so the rest of the family has not gone. We were going to go in 2020, then COVID hit, so we had to cancel. But we're going to spend some time on the Peloponnese. We're going to spend a few days on Paros Island and a few days in Athens as well. So looking forward to that. So moving on.
if you want, you can
ahead.
spend a few days in Nausea because I have the festival, the International Poetry Festival at the end of September. You're very warmly invited to
Well,
come.
thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, all right, what we're gonna do, we're gonna talk about the rewriting process. And there's a system that I follow that I recommend. And the basic principle is go from macro to micro. So before you start dive in and getting all the nitpicks and things like that, I suggest when you finish your manuscript to read the entire manuscript all the way through. Because in some of the classes that I teach, one of the things I recommend is that people write their manuscript straight through without looping back to try to make it better, because you'll have more forward momentum this way, and you just write white hot, knowing that it still sucks and it's not the way it should be, but It keeps you from overthinking it, and it allows you to more to do a better job accessing your subconscious, your unconscious. So by the time you're finished with your manuscript, there are probably some chapters you haven't seen for 6 months. And so when you go back and read the entire manuscript, my suggestion, and these are just suggestions, is to read it through as if it's a completed novel or memoir. And you already have in your mind the gold standard of what a good book is. So the question now is, does your manuscript measure up to your own standard of what good is? Here's a hint. It's not going to. It just isn't. It's a steaming pile of clay that you're now going to mold and buff and polish and make better. So as you read it through, note the trouble spots. You're going to see weaknesses. You're going to make changes all the way through that. You're going to change characters' names. You're going to start a thread and then never finish it. There are going to be all kinds of problems. Just note them without digging in. The goal is to see how it feels. And, look for inconsistencies. You may have changed people's genders, or you may have changed their names or whatever. Just note those kinds of things because you'll see them when you go back. Any questions about that? Okay. And then make notes for when you come back later. So again, we're going macro to micro. The first question is, do I need to rip it up and start over? You may have to make some structural changes, which means that you may want to start later, where you want to start where more of the drama is, whatever. But think in terms of structure. The pacing is very important. So pivot points and at regular points, things need to happen that will propel the story along. So we're going macro to micro, and the first is just, is it organized as effectively as it could be? And so you want to fix the big things before you get bogged down with the nitpicks. So now we're going by chapter. And again, the concept still remains macro to micro. So as you go through each chapter, you're going to look at it with a different set of lenses. And so one of the most important things is when you go through it, ask yourself, can I see what's going on? When you wrote this, you saw it in your head. Whatever it was that you were writing, you saw it. The question is the reader going to see it? You're not going to be able to sit next to them when they're reading the book and go, well, this is what was really going on. They need to see it without you there coaxing them along. So the goal is to show, don't tell. Here's an example. I'm a manuscript editor, so there are some manuscripts that I get that require some fixing. Here's an example of a draft that I got. He grabbed her and proceeded to drag her away, screaming and crying as she fought against him. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that sentence, but we can do a better job of showing. Here's how one way it can be fixed. He grabbed her by the hair and pulled her close. She screamed, a surprised yelp, and tried to punch him, but her fists pummeled the air, and as he dragged her away, hot tears filled her eyes and snot dripped from her nose. All right, so snot is maybe a little over the top, but if you've ever seen Fences with Viola Davis and Denzel Washington, there's a scene with a lot of snot. So, but you can see how we took something basic and fleshed it out and showed more about what was going on. So that's an example of how you can show and not just tell. All right. Moving on. Are my characters vivid? What are they wearing? What are they doing? When you wrote your first draft, you may have just been very superficial about it. Now's when you go back and add texture. Here's the first draft of from Troubled Water, which is my third novel. And the first draft was, it was after midnight on a Saturday night in a college town. So things were a bit rowdy on the street below as loud music pulsed from several bars and clots of young people roamed the streets. It's not, it's not going to win a Pulitzer, but there's nothing wrong with this. But there's a way, again, to make the characters vivid. And so this is what I did in a subsequent draft. It was after midnight on a Saturday night in a college town. Loud music pulsed from several bars. Doesn't all that noise keep you awake at night? I stood next to Marcy's couch, holding aside a white sheer curtain, and looked down on the clots of young people roaming the streets. Nah, lots of times I'm right down there in the thick of it, Marcy laughed. I shuddered. Not me. I let the curtain drop back into place. Why not? Lark, Marcy brushed aside a strand of hair from her face and looked and leaned forward. It's such a meat market. I turned away from the window and flopped onto the couch. Marcy sat across from me in an easy chair with burnt orange stripes. A Degas print of a delicate ballerina hung on the wall behind her. A meat market? She looked offended. Yeah, I much prefer a deep one-on-one conversation rather than having to endure some loser's superficial pickup lines. Marcy sighed. Sometimes I long to hear just one pickup line. So you can see what we did. We added dialogue, and it's rare that a he said or a she said in here because I've added tags, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So a lot of times the dialogue is helping the scene come alive a little bit more. Head hopping. This is something that it's an unconscious thing that you can fall into. Basically, it's a matter of being true to the
Okay, I'm
point of
in. It
view.
only took me all day.
And here's an example of head hopping. She smiled at him as his captivating eyes moved slowly upward again to meet her gaze, and he knew that she felt the same excitement coursing through her veins that he did in his. In one sentence, we have jumped from one person's head to the next person's head. And the reason that's a problem is that it diffuses the focus. It makes it a little bit harder to know who should we really care about in this scene. So this is how you can fix a head hopping problem based on this particular snippet. She smiled at him as his captivating eyes moved slowly upward again to meet her gaze. When he arched an eyebrow, she knew that he felt her excitement coursing through his veins. So we've maintained the point of view of the woman. And even though we don't get into the head of the male character, she infers what's going on when he arched an eyebrow. So we're staying true to her point of view, but we can still get a sense of what's going on. Okay. Another example, as you read the chapter and you ask yourself, remember, we're going from macro to micro, look at the dialogue. Do you need it? I strongly encourage you, whenever possible, add dialogue, whether it's memoir or a novel. Have your characters talking to each other, because when you do, they are on stage interacting, and you're no longer telling the story, you're showing the story. So, is there a need to add dialogue? I can't see what I've written here. Anyway, think these are the do's and don'ts of dialogue. One thing is, think hot potato. Avoid long, big paragraphs of speech making. Have it be back and forth. Even if you're, let's say it's a doctor's office and the doctor is delivering a prognosis, you can still have that be back and forth. The doctor says one thing and the patient goes, well, how did you come up with that? And the doctor says something and you go, is that serious? And it goes back and forth. It breaks things up and it moves things along more briskly. Another thing, he said and she said, those are fine. Much better than he expostulated. If you've got a novel that's 80,000 words and you're coming up with different ways to say he said and she said, expostulated, riposted, that's going to get pretty old for the reader very soon. So look for new ways to go to do this, and by coming up with action and description tags, you can, in a sense, kill two birds with one stone. You can have someone say something, but instead of saying he said or she said, you can show something. So here's an example. The dialogue is, got any coffee? And instead of saying he asked, he held up his coffee mug, or he held up his empty coffee mug, or he held up his coffee mug with a CNN logo on it. These are ways that you can sprinkle in the fairy dust of actions and descriptions as part of the dialogue. So you don't have to have these long descriptive paragraphs. You can make it part of the dialogue. Tags are very, very, very important. More on this. Beware of verbal tics like well and oh, and these dialogue is not necessarily meant to be a transcript. It's meant to summarize and to give a sense of the conversation. And even though when we talk, we have a lot of verbal tics, if you go through your dialogue in your novel, and you've got an 80,000 word novel with a lot of dialogue, you will be amazed at how many throwaway words are in there that you can get rid of and tighten up your writing. I suggest that you read your dialogue out loud. Actually, read your whole novel out loud. And even if you're if you like to write at a coffee shop and you don't want to embarrass yourself or disturb the people around you, mouth the words, because it slows you down. You're more likely to find the typos, and you'll also be able to tell if the dialogue is the way people talk. Are you creating tongue twisters for your characters? Reading it aloud gives you a feel, a much better feel, a more granular feel for the manuscript. Another thing to look for is to replace, can you replace narration with dialogue? Because again, if you're writing that first draft all the way through, you're telling the story, but there are ways that you can take the narration and make it come alive in the mouths of the reader. Here's an example. She opened the door just wide enough for him to fit through the crack. He'd brought coffee and sandwiches, but set them down on her living room table when he noticed the shattered glass on the floor. Again, there's nothing wrong with those sentences, but there's a way that you can add dialogue to make it come alive. Here's an example of how I fixed it. Hurry up, get in here. She opened the door just wide enough for him. He squeezed through the narrow opening. What's wrong? Hurry. She slammed the door and turned the deadbolt. Here, he said, I brought coffee and sandwich. He stopped abruptly when his shoes crunched on something. He looked down. Broken glass. What the hell happened? So we've taken something that's very basic, that is straightforward, and now we have two characters talking about it. Note that when one person talks and then the other person talks, you start a new paragraph. Whenever the focus shifts, you'll notice that I don't know if there's a he said. There is one he said, but I don't even know if I need that. Here, I brought coffee and sandwich. I don't even need the he said there. I could get rid of it because he stopped abruptly. When you are stopping abruptly, you put two hyphens together that shows an interruption, and you butt them right up against the word. And the mind knows that he's using the word sandwich, so we don't have to spell it out. And it's a little more authentic. People do speak not only in sentence fragments, but sometimes they interrupt themselves or they interrupt each other. And so you can do that with your dialogue. So there's a lot that you can do with dialogue that makes the story come alive. We're in the home stretch here. As you read each chapter, ask yourself, are all the reader's senses engaged? We're adding texture now: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, emotions. Where's the light coming from? When I wrote my first novel, there's a scene near the end of the book that takes place in a crowded diner on a Saturday morning. Usually those places are really loud. Something happens, it brings the action, and everybody shuts up because it's so stunning. And it wasn't until one of the later rewrites that I heard the bacon and eggs sizzling on the grill. So look for those sensory details that you'll be able to sprinkle in during your rewrite process. As you read each chapter, ask yourself, this is a review, can I see what's going on? The whole idea of show, don't tell. Are my characters vivid? What are they wearing? What are they doing? Am I head hopping? That basically means be true to the point of view of the main focus character. And dialogue, have your characters talk to each other. And then are all the reader's senses engaged? Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, emotions. Now we're getting nitpicky. We're going, remember, from macro to micro. Now we're going to get even more granular. When you go through your chapter again, ask yourself, you're going now sentence by sentence and word by word. Can I make this more succinct? A lot of times, in my experience as a writing coach, writers get writer's block right off the bat because they get so worried about, is this going to be first person or third person? Is this the right word? And they get all worried about making mistakes, which is the key to writer's block. It's the paralysis based on fear that you're going to make a mistake. Yes, you're going to make a mistake. That's okay. The goal is to get it down so that then you can go back and make it better. So even though you know you wrote a sentence that sucked, now's where you can go back and make it better. So here's an example of why you should never send an editor your first draft. Hello, are you lost? He leaned halfway down to peek into the window. Those people sure were different. They had to be from the city. There were 4 people in the car, as far as he could tell with his quick glance. A slight stirring in the back seat had brought 2 figures barely into view, and one of their faces momentarily caught his eye, brief as it was, leaving him very intrigued by it. The girl was quite lovely. I had to read this over and over again until I figured out what the person was really trying to say. It's a mess. It's a mess. So here's how I tightened it. Hello, are you lost? He leaned toward the car window and peeked inside. He saw 4 people, but a slight stirring in the back seat got his attention. When he looked, their eyes locked. Wow, he thought to himself, she's a knockout. Now you can see, I hope you can see what I did. It's no longer one big run-on sentence, because my rule of thumb is try to have sentences that have no more than 1 or at the most 2 ideas in them, instead of these long convoluted sentences that try to do too much heavy lifting. I don't think Faulkner would get published today the way he wrote. He was the king of the run-on sentence. Fabulous writer, but people don't have that kind of attention span anymore. So if you're trying to get published traditionally, look at how traditional novels are written. And I can tell you the sentences are short and to the point. The other thing, let me see, I wanted to call attention to a couple of other things. Short sentences, inner dialogue is italicized. And so I think those are the main things I wanted to point out. But we kept the focus on one person, made it much more succinct as opposed to this big long mishmash. Couple of final points. Can I replace adjectives and adverbs with actions? Example, his arms were big and strong. What does big mean? What does strong mean? Well, you can fix that to I touched his bicep. It was cement. Now we have a concrete example. Well, that's probably not the best word to use. We have a specific example of how you can take these vague words like big and strong and make them more specific. So you want to get rid of words that don't really mean anything and give them more heft. Can I replace a cliche with something original? He turned white as a ghost. Well, you've seen that a million times. You know, there's a better way. There's a more original way to do that. And chances are when you're writing your first draft, again, you're writing white hot. You just want to get it on the page. Cliches are shorthand. We all know what they mean. That's great for a first draft. But now you want to take those cliches and make them more original. Find an original way to say something that we've heard over and over again. Can I replace a word that states an emotion with a phrase that shows an emotion? Example, no, he said angrily. You can make that more vivid by going, no, he slammed his fist on the table. Now we have the same word, no, but we don't have to tell the reader he was angry because we're going to show it. He's going to do something, and that's going to ignite a picture in the reader's mind. The reader is going to see this happening as opposed to you just saying he was angry. Is there now we're getting really nitpicky because I know you're probably a lousy speller and that's normal. But if you are trying to get an agent, that means that you need to get your writing to a professional level, and professionals care about the details, the nitpicky things like spelling. So you need to now go through your manuscript and make sure every word is spelled correctly. And I'm not going to get in the weeds on this, but here's an example. There are two ways of spelling mom. There's the I like mom's shoes, because you're using mom as a proper noun. It's her title, as opposed to I like your mom's shoes. That's small m. These are little things, but it separates you from the amateur rookie in the eyes of a prospective agent. The semicolon. This is one of my biggest pet peeves as an editor. People, they send me their manuscripts and they're riddled with semicolons. And I think what they're doing is they're trying to come across as writerly, or to show me how literary this is. And what they're really doing is showing me they don't know how to use a semicolon. So my suggestion is think of it as a super comma. It basically separates two independent clauses. So if you really want to know how to use a semicolon, it's basically there. You've got one clause, April 11th, 1968, semicolon, separating the other independent clause, May 4th, 1954. So when you've got two phrases that have commas in them, the semicolon sets them off. It's like the hip in a roof. But when you're in doubt, if you really don't know how to use a semicolon, don't use either a period or a comma, and you're going to be fine. And punctuation. This is another problem that crops up a lot. The punctuation goes inside the quotation mark unless you're in the UK. They do it differently. So the example is, this is a quote. The quotation begins with a quotation mark. Don't do it like this. We'll close quote and put the period on the outside. That's the way they do it in the UK. In the US, we do it this way. Do it like this. Period, close the quote. And if you have a quote within a quote, there's an apostrophe that offsets that. So the quote begins of quotation, I said to him, comma, don't go out there. That's the quote within a quote, offset with apostrophes, but he wouldn't listen. And then the whole quotation ends. And if you really want to get into the weeds, I said, and you have the quotation and the quote within the quote ending at the same time, I said to him, don't go down there. You then add the quotation mark at the end, preceded by the apostrophe. We're getting in the weeds, but you want to be professional writers, and so this is what you need to know. And I encourage you to get a copy of Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. It's not real thick, but it goes into the weeds about a lot of these kinds of things. Another pet peeve is about paragraphs. A lot of my clients have really long paragraphs, and my suggestion is break them up. When you begin a new paragraph when a different character speaks, you begin a new paragraph when the focus shifts, And a lot of times it shifts in some of these big paragraphs. Short paragraph, this has nothing to do with writing, but it had, because I'm not suggesting you cut anything, but short paragraphs add white space to the page. And if you've got a big paragraph, look for ways to shorten it. Try to go for a paragraph that's no more than 5 or 6, maybe 5 sentences. And then look for a place where you can break it up, not necessarily shorten it, because when you add white space to the page, it makes the paragraph and makes the page less daunting for the reader. It adds white space. And I mean, think of your own reading experience. It's 1 a.m, you're getting tired, you turn the page and there's this big block of black ink. That's the invitation to turn out the light, not turn the page. So you want to do your reader a favor and add the white space to the page. Short dialogue does it as well. Final couple of points. I encourage you at some point, because at this point, you're just too, you're no longer objective about your manuscript. You're too close to it. That's when it's time not to bring in a professional editor, but to bring in beta readers. And I know you're going to be doing some workshopping after my talk. So getting objective beta reader feedback is really important. I recommend, finding at least 3 people and give them permission to tell you what doesn't work. These are people who will probably say, oh, it's wonderful, it should be a movie. Great. But what you really want to know is what's not working. And those are that's golden feedback that you can get. At some point, you're going to want to bring in a professional editor. I've got a couple of suggestions. I met Laura Cifelli last year at the Pikes Peak Writers Conference, and I was writing Enemies Domestic at the time. I was in trouble. And Laura, she used to be an acquisitions editor at HarperCollins and a couple of other New York publishing houses. She not only listened and helped me think through the plot, I then hired her for the second draft to really make sure that I was in the ballpark. So Laura is a real pro, lcseditorialservices.com. I don't think you can find a better editor, but there are some. Susan Malone, I've known her for a long time, met her when I was still in the process of trying to find an agent. Bobby Christmas at zebraeditor.com. Bobby has written a manual on style that draws from the Chicago Manual of Style. I use it in my editorial services. And then there's me. I'm also an editor, JohnDeDakis.com. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Let me stop the screen share. Any questions? I think I'm on time to get out of here and get out of your way so that you have a chance to have your own meeting. Covered a lot of ground. I'm hoping there's a chance for some questions, but or am I totally wet and not making any sense? What do we need? Where do we go from here, Andy?
Thank you so much, John. I mean, we personally, I can go on and on and on and have another hour. It was stimulating and it was excellent.
Thank you.
And let's see if anybody has a question or a comment on this presentation. Yeah, Patty, go ahead, please.
Yeah, John, what would you do if there is a book that has several characters in it, but there's not really one main character? How would you approach that?
Well, that depends. I mean, there's no right or wrong way to write a novel. I think we're talking fiction at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it really comes down to what works. And it's okay to have several strong characters so long as they're strong characters. And you don't have to necessarily have a hero in the story, but you do need to have characters who are strong enough that, when you jump from one to the other, there's enough substance there. So I don't know if that's a problem unless it isn't executed effectively.
The reason I asked is because sometimes I have a hard time when there's several characters keeping track of them.
And what is it as a reader that makes it difficult for you to keep track?
That's a good question.
Do you have an answer for yourself when you're doing that? What is it that the
Um,
reader, what is it that the writer is doing that's making it hard for you to keep
Right.
track?
I think possibly if they're not bringing in material from previous chapters to remind us of who this character is, then I have to go back and say, okay, well, this is this character.
Yeah. Oh, that's excellent. I think you really put your finger on it
Okay.
because you need, as a writer, you need to take your reader by the hand. Uh, you can't be the kind of, and I've come across this kind of criticism where the beta reader will say, well, on page 200, I just didn't understand what was going on. You don't want to be a defensive writer who goes, well, if you'd paid attention on page 5, you'd know. You don't want to have the reader stop and go, what's going on? And then paging back. That's the kiss of death because there are so many other books to choose from. You've just given your reader an invitation to close the book and move on. Readers read because they want to engage, but they don't want to solve the puzzle. They don't want to solve, they don't want to, you want to still make it easy for them so that they're still engaged. So I think, Patty put her finger on that.
Thank you. That was very good. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else?
I do.
Yes,
sorry.
Maria. Can you please, Maria? And then we can have Sharon. Thanks, Sharon.
Okay, I think Diane had her hand up first.
Oh, or Dan, whoever.
Okay, well, mine's quick. John, are you going to share your PowerPoint so we have those that information on the editors? Or
I don't usually save PowerPoints because they're usually too big to share, but I do have a worksheet that I can send to Andy that she can distribute as an attachment to an email. So I'll make a
Sure.
note. I'll make a note to myself to do that.
okay, thanks.
Yeah.
My question is in regard to dialogue. An earlier draft of my novel was very dialogue heavy, and I've tried to pare down a lot of that dialogue. So is there kind of a rule of thumb about how much dialogue is too much? And
Well, why do you think it was necessary to pare it down?
just from feedback from people who had read it.
And what specifically did they say? There's just too much dialogue, or were they more specific?
No.
That's maddening, isn't it?
Yeah.
Boy, that I
Oh,
without seeing it, I wouldn't know.
Actually, one person did say that she thought it was cheating in a way that I was using the dialogue for in place of like exposition.
Okay, well that makes sense because there are times when there is unnecessary dialogue. For instance, let's say you have a brother and sister talking, and the brother says, "Well, Georgia, you remember that Dad was born in 1907 and came over to this country in 1913, and Georgia would already know this kind of stuff. So it is unnecessary dialogue because it's artificially adding information that you could very easily slip in there. There's an example in Enemies Domestic where Lark and the president are having a conversation, and at one point, he says he's going to unveil a major policy, and she says to him, "What should I say in the gaggle?" Well, what's the gaggle? Well, artificial dialogue would be the president saying, "What's the gaggle, Lark?" And then Lark says what the gaggle is. Instead, I just inserted a quick sentence that the gaggle is a 7 o'clock meeting in the press secretary's office with the wire services to get an early jump on the day. So I was able to quickly explain without breaking the flow of the conversation. So that is good feedback that you can over dialogue if you're artificially inserting information that really wouldn't normally be said in a conversation. That's one way. Does that
Thank you.
help?
Mhm.
Good, thank you. Fooled him again.
My question is a quick one. You had a sentence with a dialogue within a dialogue.
Right.
I noticed that you hadn't capitalized the first word of the sentence that was within the dialogue.
Let me go back and see if I can pull that up. Hold on. Because because you may have picked up, you may be an excellent editor. And let's see if we can figure that one out. Okay, I
There.
think we're there. Okay.
The
I
next
said
one.
to him, don't go down there, but he wouldn't listen. I said to him, don't go down there. Yeah, I think that D, that that D in that probably would have been capitalized. Damn you.
Sorry.
No, I
Okay.
mean, let me just tell you, I'm going through the galleys for the enemy's domestic, and I've gone through 5 rounds of changes, and I've read the novel, for during the correction process 5 different times, and I keep finding things.
Of course.
And so that's maddening. And so I'm going to incorporate this little teachable moment and incorporate that in my subsequent
I wasn't
slides.
trying to be critical. I was
I
just
know,
asking.
but you were right. And it takes a village. I think that this is a teachable moment because I appreciate that. Um, Editors need editors too, and that was one of the things I learned at CNN as an editor. When they threw me into the mix without ever giving me any guidance on how to be an editor, and what I ended up discovering is that there are a gazillion ways to tell a story, and not everyone wrote the way I did. And so I saw this vast array of different writing styles, and my instinct was to change everybody's writing. Well, it accomplished 2 things. It crashed shows because I was taking too long and scripts were missing their slot. And I was pissing off writers who were really good writers, and I was making changes that didn't need to be changed. And so I learned that as an editor, I'm going to do my best to just make sure that the facts are right, the stuff is spelled right, and yet retain the writer's creativity. So, and one of the things I also encouraged is, here's the edited thing. Take a look at it. Make sure I didn't make it worse, because it is a two-way street. Editors need editors too. And I think that's one of the reasons now why in the New York Times you're seeing multiple bylines, because they've pared back their staff and now the reporters are editing each other as well. That's one of the things that's going on. I see your hand, Marigo.
I have a question. Is there, in your professional work, is there at some point, do you reach a limit where you can't see what needs to be edited? Because I had just, from my experience, I just edited an anthology with 22 poets, and each had 3 poems. So I edited and re-edited and re-edited, and at some point I could not see the mistakes anymore. For me,
Yeah.
they were not there anymore. So is that happening to professional people as well, or is it just me?
No, I think that does happen. And I think what it means is you need to walk away from it for a little bit. Give yourself a little breathing room, go for a walk. The more your head is buried in the text, the less likely it is that you are going to see things. So you just need to walk away.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's pretty normal, I think. Marigo, I see your hand.
Thank you. I think Evie was, she beat me to it, so I'll let her go first.
No, I'm still trying to formulate the question because I just curious how far along were you in your professional career when you began writing and then needing to edit your own work? Like just
Oh, I'm always
always
editing my
wrote?
own. Oh, I'm always editing my own work. I started playing with writing fiction when I was 44.
Gotcha.
But I wasn't 50. It took 10 years to get the agent that I've got. The
Okay.
manuscript went through 14 major revisions, and she's the 39th agent that I queried. And I've come across people who have gone through even more rejections than that, which is fine. A lot of what's happening, I think, is a lot of times people get impatient. You know, they get a couple of rejections and they go, "Oh, I'm terrible. I'm just going to self-publish this thing." And you need to take the long view, because you know the more you spend time honing your writing and making it succinct and efficient and streamlined and effective, the more likely it is that you are going to find a home for it and have someone who's not related to you say, "This is money. This is a manuscript I can make money on," because that's what a professional editor does. A professional agent does. You know, the agent, you don't pay an agent up front. The agent gets paid when the book gets published and books start selling and the money trickles down, and the operative word is trickle. You know, you're not going to get rich as a writer, but you're probably going to have a tremendous sense of satisfaction by getting your work out there and read by others.
Thank you. And just a quick question that I struggle with. Do you find you're more creative when you write with your pen or as you type, or is there any difference?
Oh, I like that. No one's ever asked me that question quite that way. And I don't know if I can quantify as one being more effective than the other. I journal with pen and paper.
Right.
And that had and a lot of my writer friends do write first drafts with pen and ink, and they say that it slows the mind down.
Right.
And I write pretty fast, so it kind of tumbles out anyway. I find, though, that one trick I use with the computer, and you can do this with pen and ink as well, but I think it works better with the computer, is one of the writing exercises I give some of my students is the interview technique that happens early in the process, where I give them an assignment, do a job interview with one of your characters. Who are you and why do you want to be in my book? And of course, you know, most people haven't started their book yet and they have no clue where they're going. And I said, that's okay. And I give them 10 minutes, and you're not writing to be fancy. You're not writing to be writerly. You're writing to access that voice that shows up. Because when you ask that question, it stirs up your unconscious, and a voice will show up. Doesn't mean you're crazy. I mean, you may be crazy, but you're also creative. And this taps into that creativity. And this exercise has the option of either being the longest or the shortest 10 minutes of your life. But most people tell me it's a breakthrough moment for them. And the teachable moment is that I say, remember how that felt. Because when you say to yourself, "Oh, I don't have time to write," look at what you did in just 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. Marigo, now it's
Thank-
your turn.
Thank you. Andy, do we have time? Is it okay if I ask one question, please?
Sure, Marigo, go
Thank
right
you.
ahead.
John, I wanted to ask if you had any tips for somebody who was considering writing an interactive novel with someone else. So two
Ooh.
people working on a novel together.
I'm actually planning to do an interview with a collaborative team. Bruce Coffin is a retired detective sergeant from Maine, and Lindy Walker is a former journalist. And he had a series of detective novels with, I think, HarperCollins, and they canceled him. And so he was adrift until he and Lindy started working together. And I want to do an interview with them to explore that. I've never done that, but what I've found, at least initially, and come back to me in a year and I may have another answer, but one way of doing it is Lindy will come up with the plot, and then Bruce will make it come alive. And then she'll read it and make suggestions, and they'll go back and forth that way. In other cases, you'll talk through the ideas first, and then you'll maybe write chapters back and forth and share them. or one collaborator may take one character and the other collaborator will take the other character and they'll write those. James Patterson and Bill Clinton collaborated, and you can kind of tell who did what. Bill Clinton knew all about the presidential stuff, and Patterson knew all about the touchy-feely, characterization kinds of things. So that's an excellent question. I would encourage you to writersdigest.com is a tremendous resource, and they probably have books on collaborating. They've probably got articles that have been written about collaboration, or maybe even Googling the topic, because I think that's something really worth pursuing.
Thank you so much.
Andy,
I think Didi has a question. Didi, go right ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I have just a quick question. I'd love to hear your suggestions. What are your thoughts on self-publishing versus a publishing house? And the reason why I ask, it's very specific. Oftentimes, the reality of the world that I live in, my skin color has a conversation with someone before my professional work does. And that's the reality that I live in. And from my, Black and brown brothers and sisters, they say, well, try to go publishing house, but there's always self-publishing because of the reality of, sexism and racism. So what are your thoughts on self-publishing and, of course, hopefully getting a publishing house?
Whoa, there's a lot of there in that question. I would say a couple of things off the top of my head. I would say that probably now more than ever, traditional publishing is open to people of color and women of color. I think that the George Floyd thing, if anything, made people more aware of their shortcomings, their blind spots, and so on. So I think traditional publishing is much more welcoming at this point. There's always going to be racism. There is always going to be sexism, sad to say. But I don't think that necessarily should be the reason that you turn to self-publishing. I am not hostile to self-publishing. I think that it is a tremendously valuable way to go. It means that there's no excuse for you not to have a book published, because one way or the other, you can get it out there. There are two quick problems with self-publishing. One is there's usually no editorial oversight, which means that a lot of self-published books have a reputation, not necessarily well-deserved, of being inferior because they have not been professionally edited. They're riddled with typos. They're flabby. They're not, tight. They're almost vanity projects that wouldn't have gotten past the gatekeepers at the major publishing houses. The other problem with self-publishing is that most of those books are not returnable in the same way traditionally published books are. What I mean by that is that most bookstores won't carry those self-published books because the traditional approach is if the publisher sends the shipping costs for traditionally published books are paid by the bookstore. And if a bookstore can't sell all the books, the publisher pays the freight to have the book shipped back. That's not the case with self-published books, which means Barnes and Noble and just about every other bookstore is not going to carry the book because they don't want to be stuck with stuff they can't sell. That means the only books you'll be able to sell are the ones you truck there by yourself and sell on consignment and then take home the unsold books. So I would say, to summarize, keep going for that traditional approach, because I think that, your gender and race actually is an advantage at this point. And it will also make your writing more professional. But, self-publishing is still there. And there is one other thing, and I know this is a long answer, but it's an important question. There are now what they call hybrid publishers. There are publishers who have mastered the ins and outs of self-publishing, but they've done it so effectively that they are now publishers. And they also offer different packages. So not only do they know how to format it so that it can be uploaded and made available, they'll offer extra packages of editing, of cover design, of marketing, but you pay extra for those additional services for these hybrid places. And there are also publishers that don't require an agent. You'll be able to submit through their portal. And so there are a lot of publishers out there, and there are a lot of ways to get published without compromising, who you are and what you've written. Long answer. Please follow up if I didn't cover what you felt you needed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for the lovely questions. And we enjoyed it so much. Before we stop the recording, can we all vote by the raise of hands? Do we want John to give us another workshop in the next few months? I can see unanimous. I'll be in touch, John. Thank you so, so much.
Thanks, Andy.
It was entertaining, informative, and every other adjective that's positive. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I think we can stop the recording now.